February 19th, 1982, Woonsocket, Rhode Island. 27-year-old Susan Laferte and 22-year-old Doreen Picard are both attacked in the basement of their apartment house by an assailant who bludgeons them with a pipe. Doreen is killed, and Susan remains in a coma for a month, but when she wakes up, she has no memory of the attack. 10 years later, a suspect named Raymond Beaver Tempest is convicted of Doreen's murder and sentenced to 85 years in prison. However, since the prosecution's case was fraught with problems, Tempest's conviction is vacated in 2015, and the state is forced to decide whether or not to retry him. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be examining a very controversial case which was supposedly solved 24 years ago, but wound up becoming unsolved again last summer. This story involves a savage 1982 attack on two women which left one of them dead and the other one seriously injured. A suspect was eventually convicted of the crime and served 23 years in prison, but his conviction was recently vacated, and the state is currently deciding what to do next. As you probably know, stories about controversial convictions have been the topic of some very popular true crime stories in recent years, such as Serial and Making a Murderer. Hell, two of the defendants in those cases, Adnan Syed and Brendan Dassey, have recently had their convictions vacated, but neither of them have officially been exonerated, and debate rages on about whether or not they are truly innocent of the crimes they were convicted of. And that's also the situation with the defendant in today's story. His conviction has been vacated, but he has not been declared factually innocent, so he could conceivably go back to prison if the state decides to try him again. So I'm going to look at this case from all angles and share my thoughts on whether this was a wrongful conviction or if they actually got it right the first time. The story was originally featured on one of the earliest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries in May of 1988, but I don't think they would have anticipated the twists and turns this case would take, and how its resolution would still be up in the air nearly 30 years later. But before we get started, let's get some business out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular feature-length episodes like this one and 15 to 20-minute minisodes about smaller-scale cold cases which don't have as much material. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If any of you feel like making a donation, we would greatly appreciate the gesture and will happily provide any of our wonderful donors with a shout out on a future episode. We have a new donor this week named Rebecca, so thank you very much for your generosity, Rebecca. And since we've entered a new month, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our wonderful listeners who have signed up for monthly donations. They are Alice, Amber, Dawn, and Casey. So thank you so much, guys. Everyone out there has the option of making either a one-time only donation or signing up for regular monthly donations, but we're happy either way. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the brutal attack of Doreen Picard and Susan Laferte. Our story begins in the town of Woonsocket, Rhode Island in 1982. Our central figures are 27-year-old Susan Laferte and 22-year-old Doreen Picard, who both live in the same triple-decker apartment house. Susan is the landlady, and she is married to her husband Ernie Laferte, the house's owner. The couple have 2 young daughters, including a 3-year-old named Nicole, who will play an important role in this case. Doreen is one of Susan's tenants and lives on the 3rd floor with her boyfriend. In a cruel twist, she is in the midst of packing up to move to another apartment building before this crime takes place. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on February 19th, Doug Heath, who lives on the 2nd floor of this apartment house with his wife and stepdaughter, he walks in through the front door and is surprised to see Nicole hanging out alone in the hallway. She appears to be locked out of her apartment and there is no sign of her mother. When Doug asks Nicole where Susan is, she points towards the basement and says her mother is lying down. Doug goes downstairs and is soon treated to a horrifying sight. Susan Laferte and Doreen Picard are both lying on the floor with serious head wounds, and there is blood everywhere. Both women have been attacked while in the midst of doing laundry and bludgeoned with a blunt object. Doreen has also been strangled with her own sweater. After Doug calls for help, the police arrive. Doreen is pronounced dead at the scene, but Susan is still alive and in critical condition, so she is immediately rushed to the hospital and brought into surgery. Susan manages to pull through, but ends up in a deep coma, so a 24-hour guard is put on her room for protection. Police attempt to build up a timeline to figure out what happened. Around noon that day, Susan's sister Carol visited her apartment to have lunch with her. Carol claimed that 2 men stopped by at around 1:30 to look at some puppies that Susan was selling, and we'll go into more detail about these 2 men in a little while. The men left, and Carol herself left about 15 minutes after that, and this would be the last verified sighting of Susan before she was found in the basement less than 2 hours later. In a chilling turn of events, it would turn out that Nicole actually let her mother's attacker into the house. While Susan was doing laundry in the basement, Nicole opened the front door for a man she thought was a friend of her mother's. This man then went downstairs, and several minutes later, Nicole heard her mother crying. The man came back upstairs with a bloody rag sticking out of his back pocket, and he was carrying what appeared to be a pipe. He left the house, and Nicole remained locked out of her apartment and alone in the front hallway until Doug Heath arrived. While speaking with her grandmother, Nicole initially described the man as having a mustache and wearing jeans, sneakers, and a hat with a visor. But of course, given that the child was only 3 years old, it was very difficult to maintain a consistent story, so none of the details she provided could be considered 100% reliable. At first, no murder weapon could be found at the scene, but 4 days later, police found a 28-inch lead pipe inside the house, which was determined to be used in the attack. It seemed pretty strange that this pipe could remain undiscovered there for 4 whole days, but there would be a lot of criticism about the handling of the crime scene and the evidence in this case. The first responders were woefully inexperienced with this type of situation and did not properly secure or cordon off the scene. Apparently, the police captain, who should have taken the reins and kept everything organized, he did not even arrive at the scene until late that night after having spent several hours at a bar. Over the course of the investigation, several pieces of crucial evidence were either not properly collected, mishandled, or lost. Just as an example, there was a bloody footprint found in the rear hallway, yet someone was allowed to clean the area before the footprint could be processed. Anyway, after being in a coma for 30 days, Susan Laferte finally woke up, but unfortunately she was unable to provide a description of her attacker. It turned out the blows to Susan's head had caused such severe brain damage that she developed amnesia and had no memory of the attack. When she was interviewed for the Unsolved Mysteries segment 6 years later, Susan had still not regained these memories, and as far as I know, she never has. In fact, Susan even claimed that she had no recollection of anything that happened in her life at all between New Year's Eve of 1981 and the day she was attacked. So investigators tried to figure out a possible motive for this crime. Susan had placed 2 ads in the newspaper for both the puppy she was selling and for the rental of the 3rd floor apartment since Doreen was going to be moving out. Either of these ads could have potentially drawn the attacker to the house, but the brutal nature of the crime suggested that someone had a personal vendetta against one or both of the victims. This idea was bolstered over the next few years when Doreen's family attempted their own investigation into her murder and frequently received threatening anonymous phone calls. Well, one name which kept popping up in the investigation was Raymond Tempest Jr., who was more commonly known by his nickname Beaver, after the title character on Leave It to Beaver. Beaver Tempest just happened to be one of the two men who showed up at Susan's apartment on the afternoon of the attack to look at the puppies she was selling. He was good friends with the Laferte family, and Susan had even been the maid of honor at his wedding. Beaver's pit bull had mated with the Laferte's pit bull terrier, so Beaver was promised the lick of the litter of puppies when they were born. So Beaver showed up at Susan's plate with his friend John Allard, and they left with a new puppy. Beaver's original alibi was that he and John had both spent the entire afternoon at John's father's house. But what made Beaver such a unique individual in this case was his familial ties to law enforcement. Beaver's father, Raymond Tempest Sr., was the chief inspector on the Woonsocket police force, technically the second in command to the police chief. He eventually rose up to become the Providence County High Sheriff. And Beaver's brother, Gordon Tempest, was lieutenant on the Woonsocket police force and one of the first officers to show up at the murder scene that day. Anyway, as the years went on, allegations would surface that Beaver committed the crime and his family helped orchestrate a cover-up. Beaver knew that there were rumors surrounding him, so in 1984 he agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed, and the results suggested that he had nothing to do with the crime, but some of the investigators were not satisfied by this and kept him on the radar. Well, in June of 1991, Beaver Tempest was finally indicted for the murder of Doreen Picard. He could not be charged with attacking Susan Laferte because she survived, and by this point, the statute of limitations on that crime had expired. There was no physical evidence tying Beaver to the murder, and the prosecution even admitted this at trial, but blamed it on the poor handling of the crime scene. So the circumstantial case against Beaver would rely entirely on the testimony of four witnesses: John Guarino, Donna Carrier, Ronald Vaz, and Loretta Rivard. At various points throughout the decade, all four of them claimed they heard Beaver confess that he committed the crime and bragged that he would get away with it because his family was in law enforcement. At one point, he apparently showed off some crime scene photos and bragged about them. While some of the details changed in each account, the main narrative of the story was that Beaver had been carrying on an affair with Susan Laferte. After showing up at Susan's apartment to receive her puppy, Beaver returned later that afternoon and confronted her in the basement while she was doing her laundry. Susan was threatening to tell Beaver's family about the affair, so a heated argument ensued, which led to Beaver violently attacking Susan. It was at this point that Doreen happened to walk into the basement and witnessed this, so Beaver was forced to attack her too. He bludgeoned both women with a lead pipe before fleeing the scene. Beaver then got in touch with his brother, Gordon Tempest, who would take care of any evidence at the crime scene which implicated him. When Beaver got in touch with his father, Raymond Tempest Sr., he was advised to get himself a strong alibi, so he met up with his friend John Allard and John's girlfriend Sherry Richards, and convinced them to both say that Beaver and John were at John's father's house the entire afternoon. Well, it is true that this alibi was completely false, and Sherry Richards would provide some more incriminating evidence against Beaver in her testimony. She claimed that instead of spending the afternoon with John Allard, Beaver told her he was going to go to a bar to meet up with his brother-in-law, Bobby Montero. Sherry then claimed she next saw Beaver sometime between 4:30 and 4:45 when Bobby dropped Beaver off at her house in his maroon sedan. Sherry noticed that Beaver was wearing a different pair of boots than he'd worn earlier that afternoon and appeared to have a bite or scratch mark on his wrist. And that detail about the maroon sedan is very important. On the day of the crime, Doug Heath's 15-year-old stepdaughter Lisa actually arrived home at the apartment house about 10 minutes before he did. Lisa saw Nicole in the hallway, and the child was crying and said her mother was downstairs sick. Lisa pretty much just ignored Nicole and went to her apartment, but she did think she heard some moving around downstairs. And most importantly, Lisa claimed she saw a maroon-colored car parked outside when she came home. When Doug Heath arrived 10 minutes later, he did not see this maroon car parked outside, so the creepy implication seemed to be that the killer was still in the basement when Lisa heard noises down there and left just before Doug got home. So the state's theory was that Beaver Tempest was driven to and from the apartment house by Bobby Montero and that one of Beaver's friends, Danny Shaw, was with them. The separate sightings of the maroon car were the only piece of evidence which directly placed Beaver at the murder scene. Well, Beaver did finally admit that he lied about his original alibi, But he had an altogether different reason for it, which had nothing to do with committing murder. It sounds like Beaver was kind of the black sheep of his family, because even though his father and brother were police officers, Beaver had his own issues with drugs and alcohol. So Beaver claimed that he actually spent the afternoon of February 19th, 1982, borrowing his brother's car to buy cocaine before meeting up with Bobby Montero. The two of them spent the next couple of hours going on a buzz ride, driving around the town while smoking marijuana, before they stopped off at a bar to get a few beers. So even though Beaver claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, he still went to the trouble of fabricating an alibi because he didn't want to embarrass his family and admit to his drug usage. Unfortunately for Beaver, Bobby Montero would not be able to function as an alibi witness for him, because whenever he was called to testify, Bobby repeatedly declined to answer any questions by invoking his Fifth Amendment privilege to avoid self-incrimination. So it was impossible to know if Bobby was doing this to avoid incriminating himself in drug activity or incriminating himself in murder. There was also the same amount of ambiguity with the motive. You'd think that Susan Laferte would be able to confirm or deny if she was having an affair with Beaver Tempest, but here's where things get complicated. Susan did admit that she had two separate extramarital affairs in 1981 and 1982, but because of her issues with severe memory loss, she could not definitively recall if one of those affairs was with Beaver. Well, in spite of these uncertainties, the jury ultimately believed that Beaver was the perpetrator. In April of 1992, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 85 years in prison. And things turned out bad for Beaver's brother and brother-in-law as well. 1 year later, Gordon Tempest was indicted on 7 counts of perjury and wound up serving 7 years in prison. Even though he was a 17-year police veteran at that point, the state believed that Gordon lied under oath to protect his brother, but he also continued to maintain his innocence. If that wasn't enough, Bobby Montero would also eventually get convicted on 4 counts of perjury and sentenced to 5 years in prison, so the state apparently believed he was involved as well. Well, here was the major issue with the state's case. Many of these alleged confessions that Beaver made to the crime took place while he was drinking and snorting cocaine with the witnesses. None of the 4 people who testified against Beaver were model citizens, as they each had their own issues with the drugs, alcohol, and being involved in criminal activity. That doesn't necessarily mean they were lying, but it is problematic when their testimony pretty much makes up the entire case against Beaver, and there's no other strong evidence against him. These were the type of witnesses who could easily be pressured and coerced by the police into falsely implicating someone. Well, Beaver eventually got in touch with the New England Innocence Project and enlisted the help of Betty Ann Waters, a woman who became famous for studying to become a lawyer from scratch, just so she could free her wrongfully convicted brother from prison. She's known for being portrayed by Hilary Swank in the movie Conviction. Anyway, the Innocence Project helped open up a lot of holes in the case against Beaver. The only piece of evidence which seemed to place him at the murder scene were the sightings of Bobby Montero's maroon sedan. But the problem is that Bobby claimed he did not even own that car in 1982 and didn't actually purchase it until 1 year later. In fact, Bobby did not even own a vehicle at all during that time. Bobby was friends with the sedan's previous owners and did borrow the car from time to time, but shortly before Beaver's trial, the owners got in touch with the prosecution and clarified that Bobby did not borrow the car from them on the day of the crime. However, this information was never turned over to the defense team. Even though Doug Heath's stepdaughter testified that she saw a maroon car parked outside the apartment house, she never actually mentioned this in her original statements to the police until she suddenly remembered this vehicle several years later. And the same thing goes for Sherry Richards. She never mentioned seeing Beaver climb out of the maroon car until years after the fact. There were a lot of questionable techniques from investigators who would often pressure the witnesses into suddenly remembering critical details, which helped their case. And then there's the issue of Danny Shaw, Beaver's friend who was allegedly in the vehicle with him and Bobby Montero when they went to the apartment house. Shaw was an alcoholic and heavy drug user with an extensive criminal record who was constantly changing his story. After denying for years that he was anywhere near the murder scene, Shaw suddenly told police that he was actually in the basement while Beaver was attacking the 2 victims. Shortly before the trial, Shaw supposedly phoned Beaver and his father to confess that he had lied and was being pressured to testify against him. A recording would eventually surface of Rodney Remblad, one of the investigators on the case, cornering Shaw outside a bar late at night and questioning him about the murder while he was intoxicated. Remblad was clearly feeding details about the crime to Shaw and trying to get him to implicate Beaver, even though Shaw was so drunk that he could barely form a coherent sentence. While Shaw ultimately recanted his story and did not testify at the trial, these revelations helped cast doubt on the credibility of the case against Beaver, and the Innocence Project continued to find problems with the other eyewitnesses. Shortly before the trial, Donna Carrier made a statement to the prosecutors about how excited Beaver's children were when their father brought them Susan Laferte's puppy on the day of the murder. Well, number one, Beaver did not give the puppy to his children, he gave it to his friend John Allard. And number two, Donna Carrier did not even know Beaver's family or become their neighbor until a year later, so there's no way she would have seen Beaver's children on February 19, 1982. Carrier also made a statement that Gordon Tempest had hidden the lead pipe in a closet at the apartment house to protect his brother. You'd think that statement might help the prosecution's case, but the problem is that Carrier had previously claimed that Beaver told her that Gordon had no knowledge of his crime. This meant that Carrier was contradicting herself and that the defense could seriously undermine her credibility at trial. So the prosecution made a calculated decision to not turn these statements over to the defense, and some of their original notes were uncovered, which said stuff like, "Too late, don't volunteer new info, will cause big problems." And there was also another serious hole in the testimony of Ronald Vaz, who claimed that Beaver confessed to the crime while they were at Vaz's farm together. Well, a search of property records showed that Vaz did not even own this farm until several months after the date of Beaver's supposed confession. And the defense finally had DNA testing performed on 3 hairs which were found in Doreen Picard's hand. While the results were inconclusive on one of these hairs, they excluded Beaver as the owner of the other 2 hairs. The New England Innocence Project appealed the case, and in July of 2015, State Superior Court Judge Daniel A. Procaccini ruled to vacate Beaver Tempest's conviction. Judge Procaccini's decision was not motivated by the new DNA evidence, which he did not feel was strong enough. Testing showed that the hairs found in Doreen's hand actually came from 2 different people. Since the hairs did not have their roots attached, this did not necessarily mean Doreen got them by pulling the hair of her attacker. It's possible those hairs could have been on the laundry room floor and gotten attached to her hand when she fell. But even if the DNA testing did not exonerate Beaver Tempest, Judge Procaccini was still troubled by the fact that the prosecution failed to turn over multiple pieces of potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, and he believed they committed prosecutorial misconduct. In his judgment, he wrote that there were constitutional violations of Mr. Tempest's due process rights that requires me to vacate his conviction. He also wrote, "Irrespective of the petitioner's guilt or innocence, justice demands the setting aside of his conviction. While Mr. Tempest has failed to provide any newly discovered evidence supportive of his claim of innocence, it is clear that he was deprived of a fair trial when he was found guilty." There are far too many details to go into here, but you can read Judge Procaccini's entire 78-page ruling online if you want to see it. Beaver was released on bail, but he's not a completely free man right now, as he's been living under home confinement ever since. This past July, the Rhode Island Supreme Court ruled that Beaver Tempest was entitled to a new trial, and it is up to the state to decide whether or not they will try him again. So even though his conviction was vacated, that doesn't necessarily mean he's innocent, and he could conceivably go back to prison sometime in the future. So for now at least, the trail went cold. Beaver is currently 64 years old and maintains that he was convicted because the Woonsocket Police Department conspired to frame him. On the surface, that claim might sound a bit unusual, considering that Beaver's father was the second highest ranking official in the department and his brother was lieutenant. We've got one side claiming that the police covered up Beaver's crime, and the other side claiming they framed him for it. Well, apparently, during the 1980s, there was a lot of dissent in the Woonsocket Police Department, which was pretty much split up into 2 separate factions who did not trust each other. You previously heard me make mention of a police officer named Rodney Remblad. Remblad's brother-in-law, Stanley Urza, was heavily involved in criminal activity and ran a chop shop before he was busted in 1987. And guess who played a major role in busting him? Gordon Tempest. Urza then cut himself a deal by providing information to his brother-in-law, which supposedly implicated Gordon's brother in Doreen Picard's murder. This is where the information about Bobby Montero and Danny Shaw driving Beaver to and from the scene originated from. If you believe the conspiracy theorists, Rodney Remblad made it his mission to pin this crime on Beaver Tempest and helped use this case as a stepping stone to eventually become Woonsocket Chief of Police. I'm sure it's no coincidence that Gordon soon had his own police career ruined and went to prison for perjury. Technically, because of the conflict of interest, Remblad should have recused himself from the investigation. Now, whether or not you believe that the Woonsocket Police Department intentionally conspired to frame Beaver Tempest, it is pretty clear-cut that they did a poor job of investigating this crime. Even if they did convict the right guy, they didn't exactly build an airtight case against him. But if Beaver is completely innocent, the big question is, who was the real perpetrator? Well, Beaver's defenders have always shifted their focus towards a suspect named Donald DeGesse. Here's how this guy first popped up on the radar. In the week following the crime, a woman named Darcy Otier received a series of anonymous phone calls from a man who claimed to be responsible for the attack, and he provided enough specific details to make police believe he was genuine. One particularly interesting detail was how the caller described attacking the victims with a tube. Well, Darcy's husband had previously done work for a company owned by Donald DeGesse. This company installed cable television, and tube was a term often used to describe the masts for television antennas. And the murder weapon was the same kind of pipe which could be used to make these masts. DeGesse was questioned, and Darcy actually listened to recordings of DeGesse's voice and thought they sounded similar to the man who phoned her. At one point, while Susan Laferte was recovering in the hospital, DeGesse approached her sister-in-law Evelyn St. George in the waiting room and decided to outline his own personal theory about what happened. DeGesse said he believed the whole thing was a crime of passion and that Susan's attacker became angry after he made a pass at her and was rejected. He even used the phrase, "For all you know, the guy could be right under your nose." Evelyn thought that DeGesse came off really strangely while he said this and became very unnerved by the conversation. During Susan's recovery, a nurse asked if she would write down the last name of the person who attacked her. Because of her brain injuries, Susan could not speak or write complete sentences at this point, but she was able to write down a series of letters, which were A-N-E-G and G-D-A-D. This information was passed along to the detectives, who tried to convince Susan to write her attacker's name again, but she was only able to scribble out the letters D, A, and what appeared to be a Y or a G. When Donald DeGesse's name entered the investigation, one of the detectives read out a list of random names on a piece of paper and asked Susan to nod if he mentioned her attacker. When he got to Donald DeGesse, Susan nodded yes. And when DeGesse's name was mentioned again, Susan nodded again. But the problem was that one of the other names on the list was Donald Duck, and when he read out that name, Susan also nodded yes. So this could hardly be considered a reliable form of identification. Later on, when Susan regained the ability to speak, she claimed to have no memory at all about any of this questioning. She had no recollection of naming DeGesse as her attacker, or writing down letters in his name. But here is the most compelling piece of evidence which points to DeGesse. After Doreen Picard's funeral, DeGesse attended a get-together at Susan's mother's house and sat down near Nicole, who was sitting on Evelyn St. George's lap at the time. Nicole apparently saw DeGesse and whispered the words, "I think that's the man who boomed Mama," to Evelyn. The girl even approached DeGesse and said, "You're the bad man who boomed Mama." Nicole reportedly repeated this phrase on multiple occasions whenever she crossed paths with DeGesse at social events. Was Nicole trying to tell people that DeGesse was the man she let into the apartment house before her mother was attacked? Well, of course, given that Nicole was 3 years old and was unable to keep her story straight, there's no way you could ever use her statements as evidence. But here's an interesting contrast. When Susan was released from the hospital, Beaver came to visit the family, and Nicole never reacted or gave off any sort of indication that this was the man she let into her house. Remember, Beaver was good friends with the Laferte family, and Nicole had seen him on several occasions before the attack took place. In fact, Nicole would have seen Beaver earlier that same day when he showed up at Susan's apartment to get the puppy. Yet as far as I know, she never identified him. Now, in DeGessie's defense, the main reason he was not pursued more as a suspect was because 2 employees from his place of business provided him with an alibi and claimed he was in his office all day on February 19th. Yet a few holes opened up in DeGessie's alibi, and ironically, one of the biggest ones was provided by Rodney Remblad, the investigator who eventually brought down Beaver Tempest. Remblad initially claimed that he saw DeGessie at a coffee shop at 2 p.m. on the afternoon of the crime, which contradicts the story that DeGessie was in his office the entire day. But anyway, when the focus shifted to Beaver, DeGessie pretty much slipped off the radar, and he passed away in 2011. One detail which never gets discussed much, but I've always found curious, is how even though both women were bludgeoned with the pipe, Doreen Picard was also strangled with her sweater. The crime was obviously major overkill, but every scenario which has been presented theorized that Susan Laferte was the killer's target, and Doreen became a victim because she happened to walk into the basement at the wrong time. Yet Doreen was strangled and Susan was not. I don't know if I should read anything into that, but I've always wondered if maybe Doreen was the original target, and Susan was the victim who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not sure if the investigation ever uncovered anyone who had a motive to murder Doreen, but it's an interesting angle to consider. So let's look at what I consider to be the strangest aspect of this case, which is how no one managed to find the murder weapon at the scene until 4 days later. The situation kind of reminds me of Teresa Halbach's car key in the Stephen Avery case. So many people watched Making a Murderer and found it suspicious that Avery's room was searched multiple times before the key was discovered, so clearly, in some people's minds, someone must have planted it there to frame him. Well, it's one thing if a small car key is missed during the search of a crime scene, but in this case, we're talking about a 28-inch lead pipe. I know the Woonsocket PD did a piss-poor job of handling the crime scene here, but unless the pipe was very, very well hidden, I just don't know how 4 whole days could pass before anyone found it. This is why it might be easy to believe the allegations that Gordon Tempest planted it there. At Beaver's trial, Ronald Vass testified that Beaver told him that Gordon had retrieved the pipe and wiped it of fingerprints before returning it to the scene to be found. A pair of locksmiths also testified that they were installing deadbolts on the apartment doors the day after the crime when they saw 2 police officers, one of them Gordon, carrying what appeared to be a pipe wrapped in cloth. But the more I think about it, if Beaver's family was orchestrating a cover-up, why bother planting the murder weapon at the scene at all? Wouldn't it be far less risky just to get rid of it altogether? It would be one thing if they were attempting to frame someone for the crime, but there was no evidence on the pipe which pointed to a particular suspect. Well, believe it or not, there might be a simple but stupid reason for all this. At Beaver's trial, one police officer testified that he actually saw the pipe in the apartment house on the same day as the murder. However, when the victims were found, their heads were such a bloody mess that it was initially believed that they might have been shot. Once they discovered there weren't gunshot wounds, investigators thought the murder weapon might have been an axe. That's why this police officer said he didn't really think anything about this pipe when he first saw it. So yes, it's entirely possible that pipe was there the entire time, and 4 whole days passed before someone noticed it and thought, hey, that might be the murder weapon. That sounds pretty ridiculous, but given how bungled this investigation was, it would not surprise me at all if that's what happened. So obviously the big question here is, was Beaver Tempest the real perpetrator of this crime? Well, based on what I've seen, I'm inclined to say no. This is a really unique case in that the police cover-up angle can be used to support both his guilt and his innocence. Either Beaver's family and the department tried to cover for him, or other members of the department tried to frame Beaver in order to get back at them. You could go either way, but I am really bothered by cases which rely heavily on unsubstantiated hearsay from unreliable witnesses, and that's certainly the situation here. There is no physical evidence tying Beaver to the murder scene, and the hairs found in Doreen Picard's hand did not match his DNA. But of course, the evidence handling was so poor that the lack of physical evidence alone does not completely exonerate Beaver. That said, the only piece of evidence which placed Beaver at the scene was the sighting of the maroon car, and it now seems very unlikely that Beaver would have been in that car on that day. And while the eyewitness testimony of a 3-year-old should never make or break a case, I can't overlook the fact that Nicole Laferte never gave any indication that Beaver was the man she led into the house. 3-year-olds might not be able to form consistent, coherent stories, but they can give off genuine reactions. The only person who seems to have garnered a reaction with Nicole in regards to her mother's assault is Donald DeGessie. I'm not sure if DeGessie would have ever met Nicole prior to her opening the door for him, but Beaver Tempest would have. Nicole knew him personally, and I think it would have been awfully brazen for Beaver to visit Susan at her home after she was released from the hospital if he knew Nicole was going to be there and could potentially ID him. As far as I know, I don't think it was ever conclusively proven that Beaver and Susan were having an affair, and if they weren't, what motive would he have to attack a close friend so savagely while her daughter was still in the house? I know Beaver Tempest has had his issues, and is hardly a model citizen. He caused himself a lot of trouble by lying about his alibi and covering up his drug use, but it doesn't sound like he had any history of violence. But whether you believe Beaver is innocent or not, I just don't see how the state will ever be able to get a conviction again with the evidence they have. Eyewitness testimony was the linchpin of the prosecution's case at the original trial, but nearly 25 years have passed, and nearly all the main witnesses are dead, or they've had their credibility completely destroyed. The state has been trying hard to reverse Judge Procaccini's decision to vacate the conviction, but I really think they should just cut their losses and drop the charges against Beaver, because their case is pretty much a lost cause at this point. So if I had to choose a more likely suspect, I would go with Donald DeGessie. I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that DeGessie is guilty, but there does seem to be stronger circumstantial evidence against him than there is against Beaver. DeGessie had a shaky alibi. He acted very strangely in the waiting room with Susan's sister-in-law. Darcy Autier thought his voice sounded similar to the anonymous male who phoned her and confessed to the murder. Susan wrote out letters from his name when asked to identify her attacker, and Nicole kept describing him as the man who boomed Mama. Of course, that's hardly an airtight case against DeGessie, and I certainly wouldn't have charged him and taken him to trial on evidence like that. But I think the Woonsocket PD really dropped the ball by not pursuing him further. If DeGessie was the killer, then he technically got away with it because he died 5 years ago, so that means the victims will never be able to get full justice. I must say, in cases where someone is wrongfully convicted, the people who often get overlooked are the families and loved ones of the victim. The victims of the actual crime tend to be forgotten when an innocent person has their conviction overturned, and they often don't receive justice because the state refuses to admit they made a mistake. Instead, they continue to maintain that the wrongly convicted person was guilty all along and refuse to pursue any new leads which might point to another perpetrator. When Beaver Tempest was getting his conviction vacated, you could see the heartbroken looks of Doreen Picard's family in the courtroom, and I can't imagine how they must have been feeling. Just imagine how terrible it must be to think you've received closure for a loved one's murder, only to find out over 20 years later that the so-called perpetrator is going to have their conviction vacated and could potentially become a free man again. If Beaver Tempest is fully exonerated of the crime, then I think the odds of them ever finding Doreen's real killer after all this time are very slim, especially if the real perpetrator is already dead. And I'm sure it must be awful for the Laferte family as well, especially if they still think Beaver's guilty, and believe the man who brutally attacked Susan is going to be walking the streets again. But if Beaver was innocent all along, then this has been a horrible injustice not just for him, but for the entire Tempest family. Remember, Gordon Tempest also got 7 years in prison for perjury, but if his brother was railroaded, then Gordon probably did not lie for him and was unjustly convicted as well. This whole thing is a major tragedy for everyone involved, but as unlikely as it may be, I do hope there can still be full closure on this case someday. So that's about it for this episode, but that's not it for the story, as it remains to be seen what's going to happen to Raymond Beaver Tempest. Is he going to become a free man, or will he go on trial again? Should you have any new information about who murdered Doreen Picard and nearly murdered Susan Laferte, please contact the appropriate authorities. Please share anything you might have which could fully exonerate Beaver Tempest or close the books for good on his guilt. But if you just have your own personal theory, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. A big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and of course a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. And you can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com. So have yourself a good week, and join me next time for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.